From this to this to this to eventually this, Cataclysm was my longest running project ever, at just over 2 years. But even with all that time spent on it, it never really went anywhere. So why is that? Why is it that I spent 2 years on a game that seemingly only went backwards? Well, in this video, I'll share with you my secrets to successfully not making a game. Oh yeah, and by the way, there is an important announcement later in this video, which you should probably watch if you care. But anyway, please enjoy the video. It all started on the 14th of May 2020. I had a pretty simple idea of what I wanted to do. I wanted to make a top-down shooter where you couldn't see the enemies. I'd had this idea for quite a while, and I'd imagined it to be mainly about trying to avoid enemies who you didn't know were there. I spent the first few days of development working on this basic idea, and it was going pretty well. I coded in some basic player movement and a basic weapon that shot a projectile upon pressing the left mouse button. I added enemies that faced the player and hid them under a sprite mask so that you couldn't see them, but when you press a button the sprite mask is disabled, allowing you to see them. I tested this out and it was really interesting and suspenseful, because you didn't really know where the enemy was, and that was pretty cool. But you could kind of just turn it off and then just play a normal top-down shooter. So I made an energy bar and made having this mode on cost energy. If you didn't have enough energy, you'd simply just not be able to see the enemies at all anymore. This made the game a lot more interesting because now you actually had to think about when you wanted to enable the X-ray vision mechanic, as I called it. So there was a lot of decision making, and it was actually quite fun. Following this, I added some very basic polish to the game, like a screen shake effect and some very interesting particle effects. My next goal was to make a new enemy type to spice up the game a bit more. It was going to be a ranged enemy that shot projectiles at the player. However, very quickly into developing this new enemy, I discovered a massive flaw. You could see the projectiles, which meant you could very easily work out where the enemy that shot it was. In hindsight, it would have been very simple to just hide the projectile under the sprite mask too. But for some reason I didn't think about that, so I just decided to rethink my game. And I realized that I kinda wanted to make a bullet hell game, because I was really into bullet hell games at the time and I thought it would be really fun to make one. And I decided, why not? Why shouldn't I? There were plenty of reasons why I shouldn't have done that, but I was oblivious to all of them, and this is something I really regret. Here's one of the recurring themes of this video. If you're going to take one thing away from this video, please let it be this. Please actually think things through before making big decisions. I used to be terrible at this. I'd sort of just come up with a cool idea and be like, yeah, I'm gonna do that. So, you know that X-ray mechanic? The one thing that made my game fun and unique, the only thing that was stopping my game from becoming a boring, unfun mess? Yeah. I removed it. Of course, I didn't realize until much later that what I was doing was a terrible mistake. I actually was pretty excited to be making a bullet hell game, so that's what I did. And you know what? Maybe it wasn't a terrible idea. It gave me quite a lot of motivation to continue working on the project, and to be honest, I really just enjoyed working on the game during this period of time. The next few months went very smoothly. I was polishing the game, adding new content, new features, and more. I recently actually found an old enemy design in an old notebook of mine. It was called the Turret, and they never actually made it into the game. They were a tank-looking creature, and they were invulnerable from all sides but the back, but they would always face you. So in order to kill them, you had to shoot them, which would stun them and stop their rotation for a few seconds. You could then use this time to run around to the back and shoot them, which would kill them. I think this is actually a really cool enemy idea. It would probably have a lot of depth because you can't just shoot it like all the other enemies, you have to actually strategize to run around it. But you know why they never actually made it into the game? Well, here's a quote from my old blog. As it turns out, this was too hard and made the game feel buggy and unpolished. So I removed it. It's gone now. I honestly don't know how it made the game feel buggy and unpolished. I really don't know what I was on about there. I think, and this is just a guess because I cannot remember, but I think I just meant it was annoying, but I'm not sure. It's still a really stupid reason. I also added in that one enemy that quote-unquote ruined my game, as mentioned in the previous chapter, called the butterfly spirit. It had a very simple behavior of walking around and shooting at you, but it did actually have a pretty cool little thing it did. When you got too close to the enemy, it would back away. It was cool, but it didn't serve much of a purpose considering you solely used ranged weapons in the game, but it did make it seem like it was an actual living creature and that it was genuinely scared of you, because I mean, it had a right to be. You could kill it in about 2 shots. I also released a few updates of the game to a small group of people in my Discord server just to test it out, but I never really got much feedback other than the generic positives most people say when they can't be bothered giving actual feedback. I mean, to be fair, I did get some good feedback, but nothing super helpful. Development continued smoothly for the next few months. I spent my time polishing and bug fixing and adding new content and features, you know, all the game dev stuff. But by far the biggest change was the new graphics, which were added in the beta 1.2 update. The sprites themselves weren't amazing, as my photo editor back then was about as good as MS Paint, but I think the cool, glowy post-processing and lighting effects more than make up for it. I remember feeling very proud of this, and to be honest, I kinda still am, although I can definitely see the flaws more now. At around this point, I'd also added in some pretty major features that are worth pointing out. I added a save system, which was pretty cool. You could make unlimited save slots and then name them whatever you wanted, which I liked, but looking back on it, it was done in a extremely overcomplicated way. I also added a weapons shop, which would allow you to buy some stronger weapons using gold, a currency which could be earned by killing enemies. The weapon shop was kinda inspired by a certain mobile game which I played as a small child and I thought it was cool, but overall the game at this point was very simple. Kill enemies, buy weapon, kill more enemies, up until the point where you could afford the best weapon in the game, which could do about 150 damage per hit, which was a lot by the way. Probably the biggest flaw with the weapon system was that the main difference between the weapons was the damage, so once you got the best weapon in the game, which was usually very early on, you didn't need any other weapons in the entire game. It wasn't interesting at all. Moving on from that though, I also added ways you could increase your maximum health using these red circle things. They were going to have a sprite, trust me. The way they work was that you would collect them and they would increase your health to a certain set amount. This meant that you had to grind for ages to get them, but the biggest flaw was that they didn't care about what point in the game you got them, so theoretically, when the game got more areas, you could simply just collect all the runes in the first area, and then just cheese the entire rest of the game with like 11,000 health or something like that. The final major thing I added at this point was a boss. This is Blossom, the goddess of the forest. I wanted their sprite to be a actual person, but because this game was like true top down, an actual person from this camera angle would really not be very interesting. So after much decision making, I went with the approach of Flower. You would fight Blossom at the very last wave of enemies within the first area. The boss itself wasn't very interesting, it basically just had a few attacks and then performed each one of them within a set order. So if you wanted, you could literally just memorize the whole thing, which I'm not sure if I like or not. But unfortunately, this is where everything starts to go downhill because I start losing motivation for the project. I'd been working on the game for about 6 months up to this point, and I'd barely even finished the first of 10 planned areas. And upon realizing this, I started to lose motivation rapidly. This game was going to take a lot longer than I thought, and I wasn't very happy with it. So I did the classic me move and completely removed the other areas and said, yeah, maybe I'll add them in an update later or something. And I rushed the entire project. At the end of December 2020, I released it to the public on itch.io and never thought about it again, and that's the story of Cataclysm. Or at least it would be, if it wasn't for one small problem. For about 4 months following the quote-unquote release of Cataclysm, I jumped from project to project, coming up with cool ideas but never really sticking to them for more than a couple of weeks. Throughout this period, I'd worked on projects like, yeah, I want to make a Metroidvania, that would be fun, to what if I made an RTS where you couldn't directly control your unit, until eventually I'd had enough of not really sticking to anything. I'm not sure why I struggled so much back then, but the idea of going back to working on Cataclysm had stuck with me for a while, but I'd always just dismissed it, until I gave it a bit more thought and decided, you know what, why not? When I decided to start working on the game again, I quickly pulled the game down from itch.io because I decided that it absolutely was not in a great state to be played. And then I started work on the update. I had a lot of big things planned for this update. I wanted to upgrade the UI, add new area, add new boss, I wanted to add new enemies to the Crimson Forest, which is currently the only area, and a lot more. Oh yeah, and by the way, a little heads up, with this part of the development, I don't actually know when I did what, so I really only have the changelog to go off and some memory, so sorry about that. I added the Golden Grove, which was the first new area of the game, and it was a sub-area of the Crimson Forest. What this means is that it isn't necessarily important to the game's progression, but it can have some extra loot that can help later in the game, if you're willing to go out of your way for it. The Golden Grove also came with a new enemy, the Icofly. It's like the Butterfly Spirit, but well, it's just the Butterfly Spirit, but it has a smaller hitbox. Along with that came the Ichor Golem, the boss of the area. The Ichor Golem is a relatively simple boss fight with only a few attacks. It can shoot a volley of 3 projectiles, it can dash at you, it can shoot a ring of projectiles, it can do this, and also in its second phase, the boss has an extra attack which just combines the 3 other attacks. It shoots a volley of projectiles, then dashes, and then finishes off with the projectile circle attack. Overall, the fight is pretty fun, but it does get a bit repetitive. In this update, I quote-unquote overhauled a bunch of older stuff, starting with the UI. I spent way too long on this, and it did not pay off. That was mainly due to inexperience with the UI system. I still struggle with UI design, but recently I found it very helpful to sketch out the UI on paper, so actually have a reference for what you want to make. But I didn't do that then, and it looks bad. I also had problems with Unity's prefab system. I would occasionally accidentally reset all of my progress on whichever menu which I happened to be working on at the time, and it was extremely annoying. I also upgraded the video settings menu because before it looked like this, but after it had a bunch of extra features like setting resolution and more. I also basically just remade the entire soundtrack. It was a definite upgrade, but that doesn't mean it's good. I mean, like, just have a listen. It's, yeah. There were also 2 new weapons added in the update, which doesn't sound like a lot, but the game only had like 5 weapons before, and they were both pretty unique. The first is the Flower Power. It's an SMG weapon, but with a twist. The projectiles follow some kind of speed curve, but when the projectiles stop moving, they actually just stay there for a while, meaning you can have a little minefield of projectiles. Second is the Crimson Horror, the first special type weapon in the game. It is a minigun weapon that does a lot of damage, but shooting it deals damage to you. The weapon also has an additional benefit. in that when you have the weapon equipped, even when you're using a different weapon, it heals you for 1 health every time you kill an enemy. Both weapons are unlocked after defeating the boss of the Crimson Forest that was added in the previous update. I also added a bunch of miscellaneous stuff like a sound settings menu because the old version didn't actually have this, and although the menu I added was very bare bones, it was still a step in the right direction. Also, these health runes that never got a sprite and just remained as red circles also got removed and now replaced with a new, much cooler maximum health increase system. You now gain increased maximum health at various stages throughout the game. You can gain some after beating wave 10 in the Crimson Forest, after beating the Golden Grove, and finally after beating the Crimson Forest boss, totaling to 500 health. On the 6th of August 2021, I released this massive update to my now growing group of playtesters, and this time I got a lot more feedback than before, and unfortunately for me, a lot of it was negative, because as it turns out, my game kinda sucked. I didn't really have any playtesters that told me, so I guess sometimes having nice people to playtest your game isn't a good thing. You really need people who are completely honest and not trying to not hurt your feelings. This time I got some good feedback, and according to the playtesters, the game was actually pretty dull, and although it was alright for the first hour or so in game, if you were to spend any longer, you'd likely go insane. And I can also agree with this. I spent a bit more than an hour recording the background footage for this video, and I am currently insane. The bad art was also more noticeable than I originally thought, so a rework of every art asset in the game was also needed, and it was brought to my attention that the UI also sucked. And obviously this is all fixable, but again, in classic me fashion, I decided it would just be easier to quit the project, or at least it would be, if it wasn't for one small problem. On the 5th of December 2021, I made the first Cataclysm progress update in more than 4 months, and it read, "I think I am now mentally prepared to try and fix my game." And that marks the start of Cataclysm Beta 2.0. My game sucked. I knew that at this point, but you see, the thing is, I also really liked the game. I had created a lot of lore for it, a whole world that I genuinely love, and I didn't just want to give it up. So what could I do? Could I try and make a new game with it? Could I somehow salvage the old version? What I ended up doing was somewhere in between these two things. I designed an entirely new version of the game that, while was similar, completely redesigned some of the most boring parts of the game. The written out version of this, in a document on my computer, currently takes up an absurd 14 pages, so let me try to explain in a little less than 14 pages. Having a variety of weapons was always the plan, but in the original game, despite having 8 unique weapons, it felt more like it only had 2, and that was because there was really only 2 weapons you would actually use. As I mentioned before, you would just start the game, save up for the best weapon, and then that would just be it. Additionally, the way you actually obtained these weapons was also pretty lame. You'd basically just kill enemies and then press a button in the store to get the new weapon. So with this new system, I wanted to make getting the weapons more interesting and make the weapons themselves more interesting. And I thought this could work pretty well with a dungeon crawler game. So I decided to turn Cataclysm into a dungeon crawler, where you would find weapons in chests throughout the world, and instead of their base stats determining how much damage they dealt, their power level would determine how much damage they dealt. And you would obtain these weapons with different power levels by just playing the game, and you would be given weapons that would have a similar power level to what you currently have, but sometimes it would be greater, meaning you can slowly get better gear. So theoretically, 2 weapons that have the same power level would be equally as good, and as a result, you shouldn't just end up using one weapon for the entire game. You should constantly be finding new weapons that will be slightly better than each other, with the occasional amazing weapon which would be a considerable upgrade. I got to work on the new version of the game, which I called Cataclysm Beta 2.0. 2.0 instead of 1.5 because it was basically just a new game at this point. Quite quickly, I got to work making a better movement system. I took the basics from the previous version of the game and cleaned it up, and then also added a dash ability to give the player some extra movement if they wanted it. All the dash really did was make the player super fast for a fraction of a second, but it kinda works. I added a basic weapon system. But with this I included something very interesting that was absent from the previous version of the game. In beta 1.4 you had 3 different weapons that you could equip: a primary, a secondary, and a special. But there was no real difference between the primary and the secondary, which is something I improved upon here by making it so that you couldn't sprint whilst holding the secondary weapon. But the secondary weapon would do much more damage, but it would put you in a lot of danger as you wouldn't be able to get away easily, so it was like a risk-reward type of thing. Next I implemented the power level system, allowing a weapon to have a damage value based upon a power level. I mainly used exponential functions to work out the stats of the weapon. Next, I worked on the pathfinding system because the previous version of the game lacked that, and it was very obvious. Given that this version of the game would be exploration based, it would be very important that enemies would actually be able to find their way around the wall. This took quite a lot of work as I'd never really worked with pathfinding before, and as you can see from a few of these clips, yeah, it didn't go well. I think I ended up spending a month and a bit on this. Next, I started working on the title screen for the game. I have a bit of history with title screens. If you've been around for a while, you probably already know this, but here's what the previous title screen for Cataclysm looked like. The first is the original title screen, and the second is the remade version because I thought the first looked bad. Tell me which one you think is better in the comments. The main problem I had with designing the title screen is that I wanted it to be good, so I spent quite a while going around in circles trying to find something good. I asked the developer of a different game called Quest how they made their UI, and they told me that they made their own UI system, and given that Unity's UI system kinda sucks, I thought it was a good idea. Until about a day into making my own, and I realized I really couldn't be bothered. Here's a few screenshots of what the UI could have looked like, and it's not that great, is it? I do think that making a UI system that is mainly generated by code could be a good idea for different things like pop-ups, because designing how each and every pop-up would look and having each of them stored as individual disabled game objects or prefabs or something like that seems like it would be a really annoying system. But for the main menu, I don't think that's necessary. After ages of working on the UI, I eventually realized that the reason I was probably struggling so much was because I had no plan whatsoever. So I created a plan, and then inspired by the Hollow Knight UI, I created this. And I'm actually super happy with this. This looks so much better than everything I'd created before. Next, I started working on implementing stuff for this new style. I couldn't use drop downs or sliders because I thought that they wouldn't fit, and to be honest, I still think that. So I basically just replaced all of those with something that looks like this. When you click on it, it just changes the value. Next, I started working on redesigning the HUD because the old one was intentionally bad, and the reason was simply because I didn't want to spend ages working on the UI yet. So I made a mock-up of the UI in my photo editor, and then the next day I implemented it into the game. Next, I started working on a status effects system. Status effects were always going to be in the game, but I never really got around to implementing them in the pre-2.0 version of the game. Status effects are basically a fancy way to say buffs and debuffs, and they basically just apply special effects to the players and enemies. Implementing them was a bit of a nightmare because I had to rework a lot, but I ended up actually creating a pretty easy to use system for implementing them, where I can just put my code into 3 functions: init, tick, and expire. Init is called when a status effect is applied to a player or an enemy. Tick is called every half second, and expire is called when the status effect runs out. This allowed me to easily create many different status effects. Then using this, I created a power-up system to showcase this temporarily, as the game didn't really have any other way to showcase them. I ended up creating 4: defense, strength, regeneration, and poisoning. Defense made you invulnerable for a period of time. Strength upgraded your weapons, which really isn't a status effect, but whatever. Regeneration healed you by 1 health for every 2 ticks, so 1 health every second, and poisoning poisoned all the enemies, dealing damage to them every tick. And that's where we're gonna leave it for this video. There is more after this, but the main reason I made this video was because the older devlogs of the game suck and are barely watchable. But the devlog that covers this section of the video is actually pretty good. So if you're looking for more content, go check out that video. I'll link it in an iCard in the top right, and I'll also put it on the end screen in case you want to stick around for the important announcement. I mentioned this briefly in Power Lost Devlog 4, but in case you didn't watch it, I mentioned that I would be taking a break from Power Lost and working on some other things for a while. So, would you like to take a guess as to what those other things are? Yep, Cataclysm. We're going to finish Cataclysm Beta 2.1. And that's not all. Kootlin, who is the other admin in my Discord server, will be helping me with the art, which is very good because this will allow me to focus more of my time on other things, meaning development will be a lot faster, and also he's better at art than me, so it'll probably look better. If you think this project looks interesting, then I'd encourage you to join our Discord server where you can find daily progress updates on the game, make your mark on the game, and much more. See you there. But yeah, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed the entire history of the game, except that one part that I didn't include, which you should go watch now, because I put a lot of work into that, and I don't really feel like recreating it, if that's fair enough. But anyway, thanks for watching.